Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
The Dogman and the Old Man. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Some memories hit you like lightning. Sudden, brilliant, and impossible to forget. I was 12 years old when I first saw the Dogman, and even now, decades later, I can still feel the autumn leaves crunching beneath my sneakers as I rounded that familiar bend in the woods. It was a Saturday morning, crisp and golden, the kind of day that made the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. My mom had sent me down to fetch the weekend paper, armed with quarters and strict instructions to come straight home. The walk through the woods had always been my favorite part. A quarter-mile journey that felt like stepping into another world where the canopy filtered sunlight into dancing patches on the forest floor. But that Saturday morning, everything changed. As I approached the clearing where the old newspaper store sat, I heard voices. That wasn't unusual. People often stopped to chat with the proprietor, but something in the tone made me slow my steps, made me ease behind the massive oak tree that had become my favorite climbing spot. And that is when I saw him. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in coarse brown fur that caught the morning light like burnished copper. His head was unmistakably canine, sort of like a German shepherd's features scaled up to impossible proportions. But his body was disturbingly human. Broad shoulders, long arms that moved constantly, hands that were somehow both paws and fingers. A thick tail swished behind him with what I can only describe as contentment, and he was making these dog noises almost like talking, in a voice like distant thunder, to the old sailor Pegleg who ran the stand. I pressed myself against the rough bark of the oak, my heart hammering so loud I was certain they'd hear it. The old man Pegleg stood there calm as could be, his long white beard catching in the breeze. He nodded and chuckled as though he understood what the creature had said, scratching it behind those pointed ears, like you might pet a beloved dog. The Dogman's tail wagged. Actually wagged. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen between terror and fascination, watching this impossible scene unfold. But when the creature finally loped away into the deeper woods, I crept backward through the trees until I could run. I never did get that newspaper that morning. Growing up in small-town America in the late 70s and early 80s was like living in a snow globe. Everything familiar, predictable, beautifully contained. Our town was the kind of place where summer nights stretched endlessly, where everyone knew your parents' names before they knew yours, and where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night football game, or the annual Harvest Festival. But even our sleepy little corner of the Midwest had its mysteries, and the biggest one lay along a certain local road. Once upon a time, that stretch of rural highway had been the town's commercial heart. My father used to tell stories about when he was young, how you could walk that road and find the general store, the gas station, and the diner, all within a quarter mile of each other. The road had been a lifeline then, connecting our town to the county seat and the wider world beyond. Time, however, had other plans. The new interstate bypassed us entirely in 1965, and one by one, the businesses withered away. The store closed when I was still in diapers. The station's pumps went dry the year I started school. That diner served her last cup of coffee sometime before my 10th birthday. But through it all, Pegleg's newspaper stand had endured. The old sailor had appeared in town sometime in the early 70s. Nobody seemed to remember exactly when or how. He'd taken over the abandoned roadside stand that used to sell fresh corn and tomatoes, transforming it into something that belonged more in a Norman Rockwell painting than in reality. The weathered wooden structure sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow it up like a secret. Walking along the highway to get there became a ritual, a journey through what felt like an enchanted forest. The path wound through towering maples and ancient oaks. Squirrels chattered overhead, and sometimes you'd catch a glimpse of deer watching you pass with big brown eyes. The woods held that particular hush that comes with old growth, a sense of time moving differently, of stories whispered in the rustling leaves. And then, you would emerge into Pegleg's clearing. It was like stepping into a pocket of pure magic. The stand itself was humble, rough-hewn planks weathered to silver gray. A hand-painted sign that read papers and sundries in careful script. But inside, it was a treasure trove. Newspapers from 3 counties over, magazines, comic books, penny candy in glass jars that caught the light like jewels, baseball cards with that precious stick of pink gum, soda bottles so cold they made your teeth ache, and in the corner, an honest-to-God soda fountain that somehow still worked. Pegleg himself was a character straight out of maritime legend. His white beard flowed nearly to his belt, and his eyes held that particular blue, deep ocean water. He moved with that distinctive rolling gait that spoke of years on deck, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of a life lived hard, but lived fully. He had stories for days, tales of distant ports, strange seas. But he told them sparingly, like a miser doling out gold coins. Being sent to Pegleg's was both a privilege and an adventure. Sometimes it was for necessities, the Sunday paper, a loaf of bread when Mom had forgotten to stop at the grocery. Sometimes it was reward, a comic book for good grades, or a cold Coca-Cola on a sweltering summer day. But always, it felt like stepping outside the ordinary world and into some place far more interesting. Looking back, I realized I became an accidental naturalist during those years, studying the Dogman the way other kids collected butterflies or pressed leaves. Between ages 12 and 15, I witnessed dozens of encounters, each one teaching me something new about this impossible friendship. The creature had patterns, routines almost. He'd appear most often on Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, emerging from the deeper woods with that peculiar rolling gait that seemed part wolf and part sailor. Sometimes he'd help Pegleg stack newspapers, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he arranged the bundles. Other times they would simply sit together on the old wooden crate that served as a porch. I became expert at timing my visits. If I saw that distinctive brown fur moving through the trees, I'd wait, hidden behind my oak tree. I watched them interact with a familiarity that spoke of years of friendship. The old sailor would scratch behind the creature's ears, and that enormous tail would thump against the wooden planks. What struck me most was the intelligence in those amber eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast. There was thought there, consideration, maybe even a sense of humor. He would tilt his head when thinking, exactly like my neighbor's retriever, with a complexity that made my skin prickle. The physical details became etched in my memory through repetition. His fur was actually layered, coarse guard hairs over softer undercoat, darker along his spine, and lighter on his chest. His hands were the most unsettling feature, neither fully human nor completely canine, with opposable thumbs, and claws that could grip a glass bottle or flip through newspaper pages. When he walked upright, which was most of the time, he moved with surprising grace for something that large. As I grew older, my terror gradually transformed into a protective fascination. After all, this was my secret. This was my discovery. I started thinking of them as my friends, even though they didn't know I was watching them. I'd worry when the creature didn't appear for several weeks, wondering if something had happened. I'd feel oddly proud when I'd see them working together, like I was somehow part of their secret world. But childhood has its own myopia, and I was so focused on the magic of what I was witnessing that I missed the subtle changes beginning to creep in. My teenage years hit me like a freight train, and apparently the same happened to the Dogman. The first sign of trouble came on a humid Tuesday in July. I had walked down for comic books, my allowance burning a hole in my pocket. Then I heard raised voices from the clearing. Not conversation, but some kind of a fight. I crept to my usual hiding spot, and I felt my blood turn cold. The creature loomed over Pegleg now, no longer the friendly companion I'd grown accustomed to seeing. His posture radiated aggression. Shoulders hunched, head lowered, lips pulled back to reveal fangs that belonged in nightmares. The old sailor stood his ground, but I could see his hands trembling as he held out what looked like jerky or dry meat. "Easy now," I heard Pegleg murmur, his voice steady despite the obvious fear. "Easy, boy." But that Dogman, he wasn't having it. He snatched the offering with more force than necessary, knocking the old man backward. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might attack, but instead, he turned and stalked into the woods, leaving Pegleg to steady himself against the newspaper rack. That became the new pattern. Or once there had been friendship, now there was something closer to extortion. The creature's visits became more demanding, more unpredictable. I'd watch him pace the clearing like a caged animal, his massive frame having filled out even more over the summer. What had once been playful energy now seemed barely contained violence. Pegleg aged visibly during this period. His beard seemed to grow whiter by the week, and that confident sailor's swagger developed a nervous hitch. He started jumping at unexpected sounds, glancing over his shoulder when he thought no one was watching. The stories dried up, replaced by worried muttering and frequent checks of the tree line. The worst incident happened on a gray October afternoon when I was 18. I'd come for Halloween candy, hoping to avoid trick-or-treaters by shopping early. The Dogman was already there when I arrived, and the confrontation I witnessed was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. He had Pegleg backed against the newspaper stand. One massive hand braced against the weathered wood on either side of the old man's shoulders. The creature's muzzle was inches from the sailor's face, and that deep rumble had become an actual growl. Pegleg wasn't fighting back. Couldn't fight back. He was just standing there with tears streaming down his cheeks, whispering what might have been prayers, or maybe apologies. I wanted to help. I wanted to rush out there or do something, but I was just a kid, and this thing could have torn me apart without thinking twice. So I crouched behind my oak tree, hating myself for my cowardice, watching this tragedy unfold. The creature finally pulled back, but not before grabbing something from the counter. Maybe money or maybe food. He disappeared into the woods without his usual backward glance, leaving Pegleg to collapse onto his wooden crate, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I slipped away without buying anything, my appetite for candy suddenly gone. Looking back now, I understand what I was witnessing. The Dogman was growing up, becoming something wild and unpredictable. Whatever bond he had shared with the old sailor was being strained by instincts that ran deeper than friendship or gratitude. He was becoming dangerous as an adult, and somewhere in that animal brain, he must have known it. But knowing something is inevitable doesn't make it any less heartbreaking to look at. The last time I saw Pegleg, he was arranging baseball cards in the glass case, humming an old sea shanty under his breath. It was a Thursday afternoon in late November, the kind of gray day that makes you want to hurry home to warm kitchens and bright lights. I'd stopped by for a hot chocolate mix. Mom was making her famous marshmallow cookies, and I had strict orders not to return empty-handed. The old sailor seemed almost like his former self that day. His hands were steady as he worked, and when he looked up to greet me, his eyes held some of their old sparkle. We chatted about the approaching winter, about whether the creek would freeze solid enough for skating. He even told me a brief story about ice fishing in the North Atlantic, his voice carrying that familiar cadence of waves and wind. "You take care walking home," he said, as I counted out my coins. "Getting dark earlier these days." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. 3 days later, I walked down through the woods to find the stand closed. Not that unusual, as sometimes Pegleg took Sundays off, but he never mentioned planning to. But the closed sign stayed up Monday and then Tuesday. By Wednesday, I was worried enough to peer through the dusty windows. Everything looked normal inside. The newspaper rack still held last Saturday's edition. The candy jars were full, and it all looked as though he just stepped away for a moment. But his truck was gone from the little clearing behind the building, and there was a quality to the silence that felt pretty permanent. Word spread through the town the way it always did. whispered conversation at the post office, hushed speculation at the church. The theories multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Maybe he'd gotten word of a family emergency back east. Maybe his health had taken a turn. Maybe he'd gone to stay with relatives. Some folks, the ones who'd never quite trusted the gruff old sailor, whispered darker possibilities about unpaid debts or trouble with the law. The sheriff made his obligatory visit, checked the property, asked around town. But Pegleg had always been a pretty private man, and there wasn't much to investigate. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just an old man who'd apparently decided to leave town without telling anyone why. The stand sat empty through the winter, becoming a local eyesore. Kids started daring each other to look through the windows after dark. Teenagers used the porch for clandestine meetings. The town council talked about cleaning it up, maybe tearing it down, but somehow never got around to it. I knew better than all of them. While they spun their theories about family emergencies and midnight flights, I carried the weight of what I'd really witnessed in those woods. I thought about those final confrontations, about the terror in Pegleg's eyes as the Dogman grew more unpredictable and demanding. I thought about the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks and his whispered prayers that went unanswered. The creature had finally crossed some invisible line, and the old sailor had paid the price. I was certain that's what happened, even though I could never prove it. The Dogman had taken the only friend he had ever known, and I was the only witness to a tragedy that would never make it into any official report. Some secrets are too terrible to share, even when they eat at you from the inside. I'm a grown adult now, and I returned to the old hometown last month to settle my mother's estate. The woods along the creek road had been partially cleared for a subdivision. Where a Pegleg stand once sat, there's now a fire hydrant and a mailbox cluster serving a new bunch of McMansions. But some things don't change, and standing in that transformed landscape, I can still feel the weight of those childhood secrets pressing against my chest like stones. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what I witnessed, and it wasn't until I saw a documentary about Hollywood animal trainers that I may have found my answer. The filmmakers interviewed a man who'd worked with chimpanzees in the movie industry back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. He talked about how adorable and manageable the young chimps were, how they dressed them in little outfits, teach them simple tricks, and treat them almost like human children. But puberty changes everything, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. A full-grown male chimp is 5 times stronger than a man and has the emotional regulation of a toddler with the physical power of 5 wrestlers. They become unpredictable, aggressive, dangerous. We'd worked with them for years, formed real bonds, but eventually they all had to be retired. It wasn't their fault. It was just their nature asserting itself. And that's when it all clicked into place for me. Maybe the Dogman had been young when he first encountered Pegleg. Maybe the old sailor had found him as something small and manageable, raised him with kindness and patience. For years they'd had a genuine friendship, built on mutual affection and trust. The creature had been happy to help with simple tasks, content to share quiet moments on the porch, grateful for the acceptance and the companionship that the old sailor provided. But nature has its own timeline, and wild things can only be tamed for so long. As the Dogman matured, instincts older than human civilization began to assert themselves. The friendship that had once been his anchor became a chain he could no longer bear. The gentle hands that had once comforted the old man now triggered something primitive and fierce in his evolving brain. It wasn't evil that destroyed their relationship. It was just biology. The creature couldn't help becoming what he was always meant to be, any more than Pegleg could help becoming fragile and human in the face of something so fundamentally powerful and wild. Maybe that final confrontation was not murder, but mercy. The Dogman removing temptation by removing the possibility of further harm. Maybe he knew he couldn't trust himself anymore, and he took the only action his limited understanding allowed. I'll never know what really happened to the old sailor, but I've made my peace with the mystery. Some relationships are doomed by their very nature, beautiful and tragic in equal measure. We all carry wildness inside us, and sometimes, despite our best intentions, that wildness wins. I've got to say a public sorry because it took me 4 days to acknowledge Lori. Please join me in welcoming our newest $10 channel member, Lori Smith, who became a channel member through YouTube. Welcome, Lori. You couldn't have joined at a better time. As a top tier member, Lori gets to see our secret uncensored episodes plus our over 30 hours of secret archived members only Dogman stories as well. Here to explain all the facts is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.